So a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. I'm Professor Emma Waring from the University of York, and I'm here with Dr. Donna Yates from Maastricht. We're just going to briefly introduce ourselves, and then the plan is that we have a conversation about contested objects, and we'll be really glad to answer any questions that you put in the Q&A box on the screen. We'll probably answer those as we get towards the end of the talk, rather than while we're in conversation. So, Donna, would you like to explain a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this kind of stuff in the first place?
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I can see there's actually quite a few people here. So I think we're both really quite excited to talk to you and to have this conversation. Very quickly, I'm joining you from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I am sitting in a law faculty. I am a criminologist, but I have a background in archaeology. I started my studies as a regular archaeologist, a field archaeologist working in Guatemala studying Maya material. But while I was there, the people I was working with basically said a huge Maya site was being looted right at that time. Someone had been killed, and people were trafficking these cultural objects, which turned out to all be true. It was quite eye-opening for a young archaeologist. And from that point on, I decided I couldn't just stay an archaeologist. I needed to kind of figure out what was going on with these cultural objects as they kind of encountered our everyday lives. So I ended up as a criminologist, and here I am. How about you, Emma?
So my background's a bit less exciting, and it doesn't involve trafficking. So I'm a property lawyer by background. I trained as a lawyer. I worked very briefly at a law firm in London as a trainee lawyer, and then went to the House of Lords as a judicial assistant before going into academia. And I guess my interest in the art world really comes through property. So whilst doing my master's, I got really interested in the question about whether, if you own a painting, for example, you have rights to do whatever you want with it. So can you destroy really, really valuable property because it belongs to you legally, even though the world, the public, might have a sort of interest or a moral interest? And that's continued throughout my academic career. So I'm now a professor at York Law School, where I teach on an interdisciplinary undergraduate module on art law, where we think about the art market and we look at the legal issues that arise around art and cultural property. And we also lead a master's program, which is also interdisciplinary, looking at art law, so the LLM in art law. So yeah, this is a great opportunity to have a conversation, isn't it? And kind of get our different takes on things. And we thought maybe one place to start would be thinking about this fossil of the T-Rex that's sort of behind me on my background screen, because this is quite an interesting example, isn't it, Donna, of some of the work you're involved in, but it throws up many broader issues about contested objects and what we're doing with these things and why. So are you happy to talk us through a little bit about Trinity?
I am always happy to talk about T-Rexes. Try to stop me. But uh, I am at the end of a 5-year project that looks at how objects function in trafficking networks. And one of my big focuses has been on fossils, actually. And Trinity is one of the fossils I've been thinking about. You probably aren't going to be able to see it, but it's blurry, of course. I have the same picture as you have behind you. This is an auction catalog for the Swiss auction house Kohler. And a couple of years ago, they offered Trinity, this T-Rex, for sale. For reasons that are strange and interesting, T-Rexes all have names. This one's named Trinity. And it was called Trinity because it's not actually one T-Rex. It's at least 3 T-Rexes, depending on what you count. The specimen wasn't complete. No T-Rex specimen is. So the people selling Trinity put together bits and pieces of 3 different T-Rexes plus some casts of a 4th T-Rex, and then offered it for sale. It sold with much fanfare for quite a bit of money, multiple millions here. But it opened up quite a lot of debate in the paleontological and museum, etc. world, because first of all, there was a question about putting 3 T-Rexes together. People were calling it a Franken T-Rex. But there's also this question about should a T-Rex like this, which is important and interesting and important to science, be brought into the private market? Should we lose the public ability to study it and so on? And quite interestingly, it was bought by a person who will apparently display the T-Rex in a private museum that has complicated status, so the public will be able to see it. But there remains this kind of open question of for how long and under what circumstances and so on. So so Trinity is kind of one of these charismatic, gigantic objects that we're all probably pretty interested in. But as it kind of moves into a marketplace or a private space, we start to ask questions about, well, exactly what Emma's talking about, ownership and how far should that go and can it go? So what do you think, Emma? What attracts you to Trinity?
Well, I mean, all the things that you're talking about are fascinating, aren't they? And there's so many themes that come out. I think one of the starting points, which people may not think about that often, is actually the significance of where Trinity was found. So obviously, this is three different specimens plus bits cast from a fourth specimen. But as a property lawyer, there's a real difference, and you will be aware of this as an archaeologist as well, Donna, won't you? In terms of the type of land or the land ownership, where objects are found or where objects come from, has a tremendous impact on both what we can do with those objects as public and also private rights that might go over them. So, am I right in thinking that if I had a fossil, of a T-Rex, where some of it, for example, is found in America, as many of these are, on private land, and then some of it goes over into federal land, we're dealing, aren't we, with two completely different legal regimes for protecting those objects right from the outset, even before it gets dug up. Is that right from your understanding?
Absolutely
Yeah.
true. So the T-Rexes are only found in the US and Canada, which means we're only talking about general US law and Canadian law. Let's forget the Canadian ones for a little while. Let's just talk about the US ones. But you're absolutely right. If you had a T-Rex lying halfway on a National Park Service land, and the rest of this T-Rex is sitting in private property, the part of the T-Rex that's on private property can be bought, sold, whatever.
Mm.
The part of the T-Rex on the other side cannot. So in that sense, the sanctity of the object, the idea that we think of this as one fossil, um, place overrides that.
Mm.
It would absolutely be the property of the property owner for that to happen.
Mm.
So Trinity is three T-Rexes that were found on private property and thus became private property. They became property of the landowner. And that landowner has infinite open rights to do whatever they wanted with it. In this case, put it together, send it off to Switzerland to be sold.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating, isn't it? Because both from an archaeological perspective, but also from a legal perspective, it's actually quite surprising that we're not so interested in the object itself, but actually we're sort of finding that location has a really significant legal and archaeological impact and scientific impact. And that's something that I think we're going to sort of pick up again, isn't it, as we think through some of these issues. But that's kind of a starting point. I guess one of my other questions is thinking about the market, because there's a really big market, isn't there, for fossils in particular, these quite contested objects, as you say. What is the kind of market like? Where are the big centers for this? Are they the
Mm.
same as the art world, or are we dealing with a totally different place?
That's a really good question, and I think we're just starting to figure it out when it comes to the very high end, very expensive fossils. If I'm the kind of person who has fossils on my desk. So, for example, this is a megalodon shark's tooth from very near where I'm from in the US state of Georgia. Got a whole stack of those. The market for this is online. You can get
Mm.
these surprisingly inexpensive. Everybody watching is going to go out and buy a completely legal megalodon shark's tooth. And they're quite accessible, quite low value. people who find them legally sell them. But when it comes to these really expensive T-Rexes and so on, what we've seen is really a move of these dinosaurs into what we would consider art spaces, right? So we see them at auction houses, sometimes as Trinity was sold in kind of a cabinet of curiosity sale, but more frequently we're seeing them in sales of art. So a very famous T-Rex named Stan, and parts of Trinity art casts of Stan, was sold for $38 million at a contemporary art evening at Christie's auction house in New York. So they didn't even put Stan around fossils. Stan was surrounded by high value contemporary art. We're also seeing T-Rexes at art fairs. There was a juvenile T-Rex at an art fair in London recently that caused a lot of stir and so on. So in a way, this is another we're talking about place. They're moving into new places, and as they move out of kind of the dusty cowboy world of dinosaur finding, they're moving into spaces of art and are sort of becoming art, and they're being potentially bought by usual art consumers. That's who bought Trinity.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there seems to be both in the sort of cultural heritage world, but also the fossil world, this sort of explosion of private collectors. And we sort of referred obliquely, didn't we, to the fact that Trinity was bought by a private individual through the Phoebus Foundation. There is this explosion at the moment in private museums and private galleries, often in Gulf states, who are sort of trying to acquire a lot of art and big ticket items, whether that's fossils, whether it's, you know, really significant artworks like Da Vinci's Salvator Mundi and so on. I guess one of my questions for you is thinking about what difference does it make for us as people thinking about this art world, this trade in culture and artistic objects, that we have this explosion in private museums, and people watching or listening may not kind of know quite what the distinction is between a private and public museum, but just in brief, it's very different in terms of the governance, in terms of the ability of people to access objects, perhaps in terms of conservation standards, acquisition and deaccessioning, which is removing objects from these places, isn't it? So
Yeah.
what's your view on this as somebody that works with these objects as well, Donna?
Well, I'm going to warn you already. I'm going to turn this around on you as a
Okay,
property
that's
lawyer,
fine.
because for most of my experience, both as an archaeologist and a researcher, has been with what we would consider to be public museums. So they are partially or wholly funded by taxpayers or by, you know, not getting into like museum financing and so on, but they also come with significant commitments to codes of ethics and codes of practice, as well as certain behaviors that are mandated by who funds them, which is us, the people, more or less. Um, so when it comes to fossils, fossils in public museums are considered to be deposited. So if a museum, a public museum, serves as a repository for these fossils, they're supposed to be available for scientific study into infinity. If I write an academic scientific paper about this fossil, someone who wants to challenge my paper 10 years from now should be able to inspect the fossil. So the question of whether it's going to be displayed or not isn't the only question. People want fossils in public museums so that there's access, but also so there's kind of a commitment to preservation. When you get to the private museum, you're in a completely different space. And I admit, I don't know a lot about the motivation of the creation of private museums and this move towards private ownership here. I mostly know the controversy that it creates in a certain fossil spaces. Maybe that's something you can talk a little bit more about, Emma.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I think it's it's again a very contested space, isn't it? So we do have this really interesting growth in private museums, private collections, in a way that in some ways mirrors the collecting habits that happened, in the aristocratic age in England, thinking about the sort of 17, 1800s, where people would go off on a grand tour and they would accumulate incredible amounts of specimens, which we continue to benefit from. If we think about Sir John Soane's collection, which then led to the establishment of British Museum and then the British Library and so on, many of our really significant public holdings have come about through private collections and then a sort of philanthropic or sometimes tax efficient ability to kind of donate things to the nation. So there are parallels there in terms of it can be extremely difficult if you're a private individual who has these philanthropic desires to necessarily be able to accumulate collections that a museum will take in its entirety. So sometimes I think people are driven by a desire to have a space that they can follow their own interests in. So, for example, private museums that specialize in paintings of children, for example, which is actually a really, really, wonderful museum, or things which focus on particular movements in the art world and so on. So sometimes it's coming from that place, but I think some of the concern that you're talking about is the fact that with a private museum, there aren't the controls that one would expect from, say, being a member in the UK or England of the Museums Association, for example. So the Museums Association has guidance, it's not binding law, but museums have to abide by a code of ethics, they have to abide by conservation standards, and it's extremely difficult to remove items from museum collections if they're governed by the Museums Association, let alone particular sort of legal networks that govern our national museums as well, which are even tighter. So there are these questions about whether private museums are good things or whether they're accelerating the market because there's competition and people are paying, as we heard with Stan, millions, tens of millions of pounds for objects, which then puts them outside the reach of public museums, which will be open to the public and, as you say, are open to individuals who want to carry out research. I guess on the other side, and I'm doing the old thing of, the lawyer who needs to only have one hand, so I can't say on the one hand this and the one hand that. One of the issues is that even in a public museum, because of space, because of the fragility of objects, we often only see a tiny, tiny fraction, maybe 5 to 10% of a collection. And there are very good reasons for that in terms of, as I say, kind of conservation. But it does mean that there's this sort of slight difficulty in saying, well, a private museum isn't always accessible and people can't always see things, but in a public museum, you can. I think for researchers and academics, yes, you can get access in a public museum to objects. But I think my biggest concern about private museums is this sort of super turbocharging of the art market in terms of pricing out public institutions and this ease with which objects become commodified, perhaps beyond the reach of others and outside the reach of researchers and the public themselves. Does that answer the question, I guess, on that?
And it's because I can't stop thinking about dinosaurs these days.
Yeah,
That's all I think about. It was actually making me think about here in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has a T-Rex in a public museum, but it wasn't purchased at auction. It was purchased a bit speculatively, kind of as it was coming out of the ground, with a number of deals being made and so on. The museum participated partially in the excavation of it and so on. This kind of a backdoor, more traditional way to source a T-Rex, as it turns out. But ultimately, the T-Rex cost, I think, about 6 million, either dollars or euros. We're getting into high numbers, which we now can see as actually a pretty good deal for a T-Rex if Stan's going to cost 38 million, because it's a pretty good T-Rex. but there was public subscription to raise the money for it. It also was costed into like the museum's model that the T-Rex was expected to bring so many more people to the museum that it would help pay for the museum's partial renovation and so on. So there's this amount of agonizing over this one object, a long consultation and public consultation, public, money and so on and so forth. Whereas during the Trinity sale, the amount of time between Trinity being announced and someone buying it was like this. It's not the amount of time the museum can mobilize that type of money, and probably isn't going to mobilize that type of money. There isn't a museum that could pay 38, or public museum, I should say, that can pay 38 million for even quite a special T-Rex.
And that's the other thing, isn't it? The value of these objects in terms of, we know full-scale T-Rex fossils are incredibly rare, as you've explained, but actually scientifically, research-wise, it might be that single bones actually are telling us something really significant that might have the greatest value to perhaps researchers, because they might change our understanding. I think you were sort of at one point talking about, if we found ear bones, for example, which would be tiny. I mean, we probably wouldn't, but if we did, that would change our understanding of how these creatures manage to navigate their world around them. So the idea of value is very different, isn't it? And I guess that leads to another issue that we're often thinking about in terms of acquisitions or deaccessioning or these contested objects more generally, is thinking about who the relevant public interest is represented by.
Right.
Is it at the local level, the national level, the international level? Is it previous generations, current generations, future generations? How are we balancing these different notions of who the public might be when we're thinking about the public interest in acquisition or conservation or deaccessioning even?
Or consuming, because I mean, this again, I'm going to end up throwing this back to you as a property lawyer, but I always feel like when it comes to these really important cultural objects, and I think we're treating our dinosaurs as cultural objects. We've also, Jurassic Park tells us these are cultural objects, but there's almost a conflict or friction between what we see as a enshrined right to private property, to owning things, that we see in UK law. I'm American, and we see in American law for similar reasons. Just really at the core of what we legally believe, but also culturally believe, that we can own something, and this kind of higher loyalty to a more collective idea of a shared cultural heritage, to something greater than our personal ownership. And I feel like we have kind of a hybrid treatment of this that works sometimes, but other times it doesn't work, where we see something that is fully legal but would hurt us. And or something else that's totally legal, but we don't have a problem with it. So for example, like the idea that somebody who's just bought a Monet painting lights it on fire because they feel like it, that's totally within in their rights. And I know I feel like I'm going off a little bit from the track you set, but when we're saying who's public, what are we protecting? Are we protecting a person's right to both light their Monet on fire, but also deal with their property as they see fit? Or are we protecting a more collective idea of cultural and heritage that really is not a strong part of our legal tradition? So either side feels a bit funny. What do you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is a great question and a great problem area, actually, one that we really haven't resolved. I mean, you're absolutely right. In terms of thinking about examples where this is played out in the real world, people watching us may know about the destruction by Clemmy Churchill of Churchill's portrait by Graham Sutherland, which is most infamous for the fact that Churchill loathed it. He was given it as his 80th birthday present by Parliament. Took it home. And we understood years later that it had basically been slashed and then burnt, because he hated the fact that it made him look half-witted. He'd had a stroke, and that was visible on this portrait. Um, it's one of those examples where you're absolutely right that we have a clash between law and ethics, or a law that really is important to all of us actually from a property perspective. So if I buy, for example, a cup of coffee or a biro or a Mars bar, whatever it might be, I'm buying those objects specifically to consume them entirely, to destroy them. You know, I want to use the biro till it runs out of ink. I want to drink and consume the coffee. I want to eat the food, whatever it might be. So, as an owner of anything, it's really important that we have this legal right to consume something or to destroy something. It's a kind of important corollary of the right to use, which is actually really significant. So even from Roman times, we've always accepted ownership carries with it the right to destroy if you're an absolute owner of something. Now, that's great, but the problem is, as you said, and we're kind of talking around, that when we come to these very special objects where other people may feel that they have some kind of public interest in the preservation of this heritage, maybe because it means something to them, maybe it means something to the country that they're part of, we hit, don't we, this roadblock where, absolutely right, you know, if you own this painting fully, say Sutherland's portrait of Churchill, Churchill and his wife were well within their rights to destroy that, even though we might look at that now as an act and think, well, that's really sad because we only have sketches of, or sort of preparatory works that show us what the finished portrait was like. We can't recreate the original. And so there is this huge tension, I think, in terms of cultural property, artworks, where once we destroy something, we lose that thing forever. Now, in some cases, people might argue that's a good thing. You know, there might be some contested objects that we think we really don't want to have these on display, or we don't want to glorify these types of objects. And one of them that I've got above my head, if you can see it, hasn't been fully destroyed, but it's the Colston statue, which was torn down in the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, actually 5 years ago this month, isn't it? And that statue was torn down by protesters because it seemed to be glorifying a man who had been a slave trader, and the values espoused by the statue were not ones that people seeing it wanted to have in that kind of public space. So again, we're going back to this question, aren't we, of who decides this stuff? You know, is it us currently? Do we actually say, well, no, in the past it was fine to have this, so we need to stick with it forevermore? Or do we have to think, well, actually, the future might look at this differently, and future generations might want to know that this was part of a significant movement, and actually we need to kind of think about it. What are your views on this, Donna, in terms of who the public interest is best represented by, or how museums and galleries might juggle this? It's a big question.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to
No.
juggle it perfectly or well.
Yeah.
Because I think the idea of defaced and destroyed statues are really quite a good way to think this through, in that um, we can see heritage items as something that must be preserved at all costs and not touched. It must remain exactly like this. Or you can see them as living objects that are something to be interacted with, and so on. Pulling an example out of my sordid history, I lived in Glasgow for 8 years before I moved to Maastricht. And one thing I accidentally got very involved in is passionate defense of the traffic cone that is placed on top of the head of the Duke of Wellington statue in downtown Glasgow, which accidentally resulted in a friend of mine and I collecting something like over 10,000 public comments about what the cone means to people. On the one hand, there's this, historical listed protected statue that is damaged potentially by people climbing on top of it. On the other hand, and it's of the Duke of Wellington, who, as far as we could tell, has never went to Glasgow. It's not connected at all. But then you have this kind of multi-decade tradition of people going to Glasgow to see if the cone is there, to after a quite exciting night, if noticing the cone is not there, reconing the statue and so on. And the cone itself is kind of a stand-in for how Glaswegians see themselves and how they kind of some nose a little bit at the authority in a good-natured way and so on. So calls to raise the plinth of the statue so people couldn't put the cone onto it led to protests because this type of interaction was important. So if you're talking about who's public, you can go with the side of complete preservation, raise the plinth, make, possibly Glaswegians fall off of it drunk and get their legs broken as they try to put the cone on and so on. Or you can kind of see this heritage object as something that evolves and changes with us. So we all like the cone. Okay, we'll keep the cone. It becomes more complicated when you're talking about removing and destroying things, but there is also an argument to be made that destruction is part of the life of these objects, and halting cultural interactions with them is difficult. But this, on the other hand, undermines the preservational aspects of museums and the idea of protecting these monuments. I guess that's my long Glasgow cone way of saying there's the public now, there's the public of the future, there's the public of the past, and there's no good answer, really. I should also say, I see that we've got questions coming into the questions thing. We will save time for those. We do see those. We're not ignoring you.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it? This idea of a dynamic, changing sense of working out who the public are and this sort of contested nature of objects. I mean, thinking about this in terms of comparing the past to the present, we have many, many museums that have objects which would no longer be collected and actually, frankly, should not be displayed. So I'm thinking here, for example, of a movement which has really taken speed, hasn't it, in the past few years in terms of returning, say, Maori heads to New Zealand. For those that aren't aware of this, many museums hold specimens of human remains in one form or another. So we're kind of comfortable maybe with seeing the Egyptian mummies at the British Museum, but there are also medical specimens in many medical museums. But in the sort of early Victorian period and a little before that, there was a great interest in collecting, again, this kind of idea of cabinet of curiosities, and people collected severed heads of Maori individuals, collecting them for their tattoos and so on. And these heads are in various collections around the world. Again, I know you've got a New Zealand, a Kiwi link, Donna. These are objects which previously people were happy to just look at and just think, oh, that's curious. But actually, we've now kind of moved forward, haven't we, and realized that there's a really deep spiritual, cultural connection here. That means it's really not appropriate for these types of objects to be gawked at or looked at in this way. And so there's been a big move to repatriating these types of objects, hasn't there? Are you happy to kind of talk about that briefly?
I'll say, I think you and I agree that it's inappropriate. We would both say personally we believe it's inappropriate. But the thing to always note is that somebody else doesn't think it's inappropriate. But we'll get back to that. And I see one of our questions is about our view on display of human remains in museums.
Okay, great.
So I mean, when it comes to the heads, like these are almost an easy type of human remain to talk about because they were collected under very dubious circumstances, with complicated questions about consent and so on. They may actually be relatively recent people who have been alive quite soon. So when we're talking, this is like great grandpa's head. We're literally talking about that. Maybe another great. So and within modern Maori culture, these are Tonga, these are ancestors that still have life and so on. So internal to New Zealand, there's a strong desire to have these family members come home.
Mm,
And when it comes to public museums, it's been a kind of convincing argument, and a lot of these have been returned. The National Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa, has a repatriation hall to
mm,
welcome them home. They send a special delegation to welcome them, to get them and welcome them home because they're people. Um, but this goes back to what we we're talking about, place and public and private situations, because there's a lot of openness for a negotiation for the return of a Maori ancestor from a public museum for many reasons, because they public museums are almost and sometimes absolutely obliged to have this discussion and negotiate this. And
mm.
moving forward with complying with museum ethics and so on, they need to talk about it, and most come to the same conclusion: return the heads. If the head is held by a private individual, there's there's little that can be done other than talk to them. There's nothing preventing the head's ownership. It feels very weird to say that. There's nothing preventing that. I've got more auction catalogs over here from the 1980s, Sotheby's and Christie's, the ones selling the high-end auction houses, selling these heads in London
Mm,
for sale, in the 80s and within my lifetime.
mm.
So we're back to this like location difference, that we may think that it's the right thing to do to return these heads, but the conversation only really happens depending on where the head is and who owns it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it feels weird to kind of have that conversation, doesn't it, in terms of thinking that through. Because in English property law, you can't own bodies as such, but you can own bodies which have been subjected to particular procedures or sort of dealings with them. So I'm thinking about the Bodyworks exhibition
Yeah.
years ago, where people donated their bodies specifically to be exhibited in kind of the muscle form and so on. And those kind of exhibits, these bodies were capable of ownership, just as these objects are, which feels very strange, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, just as we're kind of wrapping up, I guess, before we come to the questions, I suppose one of my questions would be, we don't really know, do we, what are going to be the contested objects of the future? What is it that's in current life that actually we might want to collect because actually it's going to be significant, or predicting what it is that in future people may not want to collect. So I'm thinking here about difficulties people have had in the past, for example, say in the States with collecting Confederate objects, where actually there are whole museums full of objects from a sort of movement that's glorifying kind of a white supremacist approach historically, and also slave owning. But at the time, those museums would have thought this is a really important part of American history, and it still is, for us to collect these objects. So it's hard to know, isn't it? I think if you're in this field, whether actually people will look back at us collecting objects like Trinity and think, how could you possibly do that?
Right.
Or whether there are things that we're just missing at the moment that will become the contested objects of the future, where people will look and think, how on earth could you be dealing with this, have a market for this stuff?
Yeah.
Do you have any views on that?
I it will be interesting to find out.
Mm,
I mean, I don't know if I told you this. I'm actually from the American Deep South, so
mm,
and the ubiquity of Confederate monuments is startling. And
mm,
considering my own positionality and so on, like growing up around these monuments, it was a huge blind spot to me to not notice that obviously these are upsetting. Obviously these are
mm,
going to get torn down one day and so on. But I think for many wasn't obvious. So there's kind of a constant critical reflection of our blind spots that we need to have, and I suppose prepare for them. But indeed, the kind of the what will be bad next, or also what will no longer be negative is quite interesting thing. So like I think we thought a little bit about obscene artworks and so on. Um, the if you go to the Pompeii Museum near in Naples and so on, there's a whole separate room where you have all your very obscene Roman art and so on, which of course everybody goes in. Everybody wants to see that. And you see other museums that incorporate Roman and Greek obscenity into their regular collection and so on. But that feels like a leftover of these are also objectionable, and now we can handle that. So I think there's two sides. But what do you think? What will we be upset about next?
It's something that I really wonder about. I do wonder about some of the work where, for example, modern photography or even Victorian collectors, where, for example, say in the time of Lewis Carroll and others, it was perfectly acceptable. It seems quite weird to us now to have photos or pictures of kind of prepubescent children shown nakedly. I think today people feel more uncomfortable with that, putting Lewis Carroll aside anyway. And I think one of the things that's always really interested me is that when we have a conversation with students in our art law course, and we have art historian students with law students together, if, for example, we look at modern photographers like Sally Mann, who photographed her, I think, 11-year-old daughter, not showing anything that actually is inappropriate. But just the positioning of her daughter resembles, courtesans, say in Titian's Venus de Milo and so on, lying in a particular way, even though you can't see anything. Students become very, very anxious about that, in terms of really uncomfortable. And that's been a change even while I've been teaching, that more and more students from both disciplines are looking at pictures and kind of thinking, that doesn't feel quite right, even though it wasn't predatory, it doesn't show anything. So I do wonder if those kinds of objects, the sort of Victorian stuff, and moving forwards to more modern, may be something that people say, no, we don't want this on display. But that's only a guess. I don't really know.
Thinking about it, like I wonder if just generally objects, artwork, things that have this kind of question of consent,
Yes.
like that will continue to be something that grows. I mean,
Mm,
this is a photograph of a child
mm.
taken by their parent, but did the child consent for this to happen? So we think I'm thinking of like uh, uh, people who are becoming adults now or young adults now who hate the digital background that their parents have
Yeah.
created for them, is that they put all their photos on Facebook and Instagram and
Mm,
so on.
mm.
So there seems to be a societal backlash in the upcoming generations against things that have been done without quite a higher level of consent. So I wonder within contested objects, we'll be looking at
Mm.
higher standards for what is consented for all sorts of different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we come back, don't we, to this idea of location, that
Yeah,
the publicness of this is the issue, perhaps, rather than more than that. I mean, we
exactly.
could carry on chatting
Yeah.
for hours on this, couldn't we? But we have got some questions. Should we just have a kind of quick whiz through these? And I'm sorry in advance if we don't get through all of them, but we'll try and deal with them
Yeah.
speedily.
I wanna point out to you, not to skip anybody who had any order, but the one down at the bottom is asking about a ban on taxidermy mounts. And
Mm,
this is exactly something Em and I talked about.
yeah, it is.
So do you have some thoughts on that? It's the question at the very bottom. It says, can you see a day where there'll be a ban on taxidermy mounts? Many people feel uncomfortable seeing animals, birds, etc. on display in this way.
Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, it's one of these things we have, actually a growing and burgeoning focus in legal academia, thinking about animal rights. Um, we're hearing all the time more and more scientific discussion, aren't we? For example, about the sentience of octopi and so on. Obviously, we're not going to see those on a taxidermy mount, but at the moment, I can't see them being banned. It would also, I think we were talking about how many specimens places like the Natural History Museum have. I mean, they have warehouses full of drawer after drawer of stuffed birds, for example, all sorts of things, which we might want to get rid of. But actually keeping those scientific specimens, seeing them, perhaps even seeing extinct species and so on, is really helpful scientifically for people to be able to understand perhaps what happened, what diseases affected different groups of animals and so on. It's a possibility. I can't see it happening anytime soon. But watch the space. If we come back in 10, 15 years, maybe that will be the thing that's gone. But it's a great question.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And again, like this is just the first thing that came to my mind because we've been thinking of public and private space.
Mm,
When I drop my child off for scouts, there is a house that very publicly in a giant front window displays what appears to be their taxidermized dead cat.
right.
And
Yeah.
I do find it disturbing and so on. Um, but even in a situation where we banned taxidermy or we socially decided taxidermy in public museums is not the right thing to do,
Mm,
in a private space, even with a public display, someone can still display their creepy cat, for
mm,
example. So yeah. So how about we look at another question here?
mm.
Do you have any that catch your eye, Emma, or shall we?
I think there's one here that's quite interesting, isn't it? In terms of thinking about protests leading to
Yeah.
spoiling artworks. So, for example, paintings in museums, we've seen a lot of this, haven't we, with the Just Stop Oil campaigns. Um, I mean, I think there's a really long history of, as we know, things like the Right to Be Venus and so on with the suffragettes. There's a long campaign of people using artworks, using objects to make a point. I think where I have problems with this are situations where people damage the artwork to significantly make a point. Um, because I think again we're back in this balancing, aren't we, of the different publics and private interests here. So yes, I think it can be really important to use artworks as a backdrop. I'm not advocating that, by the way, but I can see it as a backdrop. It grabs attention in a way that many other things don't. But in terms of then thinking about, well, what does that mean for current generations, future generations? I feel it's tremendously sad to destroy something in such a way that it's irredeemably lost for others.
Yeah.
But again, I can see why people want to use artwork. Art is all about communication.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. So there are questions there, aren't there, about that?
Yeah. But I saw recently, I think that Just Stop Oil has said that they're going to stop
Yeah.
this particular type of art activism, and
Mm,
I'd be interested in hearing from them why. It's something I'd like to look more into,
mm,
whether it's for what are the reasons. Like I wonder if it's in this particular case particularly effective, and
And whether it backfired against public
yeah.
support, I think, is an
Yeah,
issue. Yeah.
because like completely unrelated to the focus of it, there a little bit of my research, some of the backfire seems to be we have a very big art fair here in Maastricht, TEFAF.
Mm,
It's one of the biggest in the world. And a couple years ago, there was a massive armed art heist during the middle of the fair where people came in with guns and bashed some glass containers, took jewelry out, some historic jewelry and so on. And I was there the day before and the day after, and getting kind of real. It's an art heist in my town. I'm
mm,
study art crime. Um, but when I went over there and started interviewing people who had witnessed the heist, who were around it, um, a lot of people said their first reaction is they thought they were either watching protest action or performance art.
mm,
So
mm.
they weren't even frightened when they saw people with guns and a hammer bashing this in. And there's
Yeah.
videos of this heist where people are just kind of standing around watching it happen
Mm,
because the the climate, the atmosphere of what was going on made them feel like something else was happening. And literally the next day was the first day that someone kind of glued their hand to a painting in Glasgow.
Mm,
So there's this kind of odd side effect. But on the other side of things, what we also have seen when it comes to these protests is some interesting like legal backlash in certain places. So
mm,
Italy has changed its law to specifically criminalize the damaging of art cases.
mm,
So in this case, this would mean you haven't even damaged the art. You've kind of scratched the case or made it dirty. That in itself is a, a, a specific criminal act, which the Italian art lawyers I know say that was already a criminal act.
yeah.
It didn't need extra criminalization. You already were vandalizing something.
Mm,
Um, which makes that law itself, this is the way they see it. I can't read Italian law. They see it as kind of retaliatory, as not being legally necessary, but as making a social statement against these protesters and thus kind of against whatever they're protesting for, so to speak.
mm.
So it it's almost like the law using the power, the politicians creating the law, also using the power of art in the
Mm.
same way as the protesters to make a counter statement. It's yeah,
Yeah,
complicated.
it's really tangled, isn't it? There's a
Yeah.
couple of great questions that also come together here about museums. There's one about spending so much time collecting that we end up spending too much time collecting at the expense of living in the present, and how we deal with collecting. And then there's a really, really good question, which goes to the heart of many of the issues people in the sector are dealing with, doesn't it? About funding models.
Oh yes.
So the question is about whether museums that exist for the public benefit, but don't have enough public funding to enable free admission. How do we square that with charging for admission? I don't know if I start off on these and then chip in,
Yes, please.
obviously, Donna. Um, in terms of the collecting, this is a perennial issue. I think the real problem is that it's so hard, as we've been saying today, to know exactly what it should be that you should be deaccessioning or removing from collections. So, it might be that if I'm at the Victoria and Albert Museum and I think, oh gosh, I've got several hundred Victorian porcelain tea services, does it really matter if I deaccession or I get rid of some of these tea services? Or if I've got things which are copies or multiples, for example, I'm thinking here, Samian pots, where lots of museums will have pot sherds of Samian Roman sort of pottery or Roman coins, for example. There may well be cases where people would think, actually, we could deaccession, we could move this to other museums, perhaps local regional museums, or perhaps even, as sometimes happens in the States, much more often in the States, sell objects so that we can then buy in new objects to diversify our collections. And some museums, because they have a different regime, have been doing that in the States in a way of actually accumulating funds to be able to diversify. The problem is, as everyone in the sector knows, it's so hard to know what will be valuable. So a while ago, Donna and I were talking about the fact that some years ago, museums got rid of plaster casts that they had taken of objects because plaster casts were taken often to enable people who couldn't go on a grand tour, couldn't access things because of difficulties of travel, to see objects. So I'm thinking here about the plaster court, in the V&A where we've got Trajan's Column and so on. Many museums got rid of these plaster casts, and yet today, those plaster casts are so valuable for researchers because they are often in much better condition than the original objects. Thinking about Trajan's Column in Rome, it's been attacked by traffic fumes, acid rain, and so on. And actually, the relief that we have that we can see on the plaster cast is much better in terms of quality for research purposes. So there's this perennial issue, I think, about what you get rid of. and how you balance that with perhaps changes in the future where people may think it would have been really helpful to have had that. In terms of funding, I am in awe genuinely of the hard work that our heritage sector, arts sector does day in, day out. It's often a sort of Cinderella service. It doesn't get the recognition that I think it deserves in terms of what it adds to people's lives, in terms of deepening access and joy and making sure that these beautiful objects, these interesting objects, can tell their stories to as many people as possible. Given that we don't have endless public funds and it's been cut time and time again in the sector, I think we have to be realistic that many public organizations will have to charge for elements of collections. And I'm always quite struck when I go to other countries. You know, if you go to, for example, New York and go to some of the big museums there, they charge a lot for accessing museums. We're so lucky that we can access so many museums for free or for very reduced prices in this country. And I think if we don't want to have corporate sponsorship or greenwashing, art washing, if people don't want that, then we have to accept that the public funds are not going to be enough to keep these institutions going and for the people to do the amazing conservation work we have. Yeah. So it's a really difficult thing. Sorry, that was a long answer. Donna, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll go staying with the museum funding and so on. I think one of the issues I had with particularly the Just Stop Oil protests and so on involving getting close to damaging artwork and things like that. And understand I'm not in any way criticizing the message at all or what the goals of the protesters are. But the issue of targeting art and museums and so on, and the type of shaming used to point out corporate oil sponsorship and stuff in museums or so on, always felt to me like attacking another victim of the same thing. Like the museums are in this position of taking this money, or are in other terrible positions of underfunding and so on, because of, in my opinion, the same misdirected use of funding that isn't going to actively and aggressively preventing climate change. We're the same underfunded thing. We're the same pushed aside sector. So every time it would happen, I'm like, we're suffering too. We're the same important good for humanity thing that is easy to cut, because every time a little bit more of national or local level museum and libraries and archive budget gets cut, people are not rioting in the streets.
Yeah.
And people aren't voting based on museum funding. So whenever anybody feels like cutting anything, we're an easy target, because there we are quietly. So I think until we are voting based on the access to these important things, we are going to be in this situation where we can't expect museums to do anything else but either fold or charge. And there will come a day, I think, if something doesn't change in the trends, that UK museums will end up charging more than they do now. Just it's that's a negative thing to end on here. Do we have something more positive to end on?
I think we're out of time, aren't we, sadly? Yeah. But I think just to say, I think the fact that so many people have come today is a great encourager that people care about these objects, the institutions that are involved in their care and conservation, collection, deaccessioning. And it's about having these conversations, isn't it? And looking at these objects holistically, thinking through, how do systems work? Are there things that we could be doing to improve this? So I just want to say a really big thank you, as Donna said, to all of you for listening. It's been so great having this conversation. And thank you so much for all the questions, which are really thoughtful. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them. But hopefully we might do this again another time, and
Yeah.
that would be great. So thank you very much for attending.